Hello chums, and welcome to Tuning for Beginners, the series where I'll be covering every aspect of tuning and tweaking in Gran Turismo 7 to help those who are struggling. This series is aimed at road cars, since they are affected much more than race cars by changes to tuning. It's worth mentioning that my advice here will hopefully help you with consistency, but not necessarily with speed, so if you're chasing the last few tenths of a second at Sardinia to make grinding more efficient, I'm afraid this series probably won't help you. Now let's begin. Today's topic is differential tuning. For something so cheap, a well-sorted differential can make a huge difference to the way your car drives, something that applies in the real world as much as it does in Gran Turismo. I'll start by trying to explain differentials as best I can, and then I'll go over the various tuning options, followed by a simplified explanation of what each adjustment can do to the car's behaviour, and I'll end with a few examples. So, a differential, or Diff, is basically what the engine's power is sent through before it reaches the drive shafts that send the power to the wheels. There's three types I'll cover today: the locked diff, the open diff, and the limited slip diff. While it's not modelled in Gran Turismo 7, I'll briefly explain locked or welded differentials. The closest we can get to this in the real world without modifications is in cars with selectable four-wheel drive, such as the Suzuki Jimny or the Jeep Wrangler. These cars are rear-wheel drive during daily use, where the rear wheels have an open differential. However, when you select four-wheel drive, the front wheels get power through a locked differential. What this means is that both wheels have to spin at the same speed. This works fine on a 4x4 being used on a low grip surface or in a drift car that's supposed to lose grip, but in daily driving, a locked diff will result in skipping when turning tight corners. This is because both wheels try to spin at the same speed, but the outside wheel needs to spin faster because it's covering more distance. If you drive a basic car in the real world, such as an entry-level Ford Fiesta, it will likely have what's called an open differential. In Gran Turismo 7, cars that have this are typically lower-tier front-wheel drives and the vast majority of classic road cars. This is represented by the differential values showing as 0 in the settings. In the real world, an open differential is a cheap way to allow the driven wheels to spin at different speeds, which is great for going around sharp corners. The issue is that the power coming through the differential will take the path of least resistance, which means that the inside wheel that has less weight over it will get more power, which will spin, causing the one-tyre fire you may have heard of. In Gran Turismo 7, cars with open differentials have a messy driving feel with two main traits. The first is excessive wheel spin. See how the revs climb when exiting the corner, because the inside wheel is spinning up, and when the car straightens and both wheels get equal power, the revs drop and the car grips up. The other trait is lift-off oversteer. This means the car has very exaggerated transitions between corner entry and corner exit. The other type is a limited slip differential, or L.S.D for short. To oversimplify things, it can send power to the wheel that has the most grip, instead of an open diff which sends it to wherever is easiest. It can also limit slip during engine braking if you have a two-way system. Using the Volvo V40 from earlier and fitting an L.S.D to it, you can see that the wheel spin is almost gone and the car is much more composed, with less violent transitions between entry and exit. The powerful Chevrolet Corvette has also tidied up. While it will still spin its wheels, the transition to oversteer is much smoother and more predictable. So, now I'll go over some tuning options. The first is a one-way L.S.D. This only intervenes when accelerating, which means that whatever car you fit this to will have the benefits of better power delivery out of the corners, but can be prone to lift-off oversteer or oversteer under braking. The only situation I can think of where this may be beneficial is in a front-wheel drive on a tight track like Tsukuba. The next option is the two-way differential. This is the same as the next option, except it can't be adjusted, and as such, it's more or less pointless. Next is the fully customizable limited slip differential. This is the same as the two-way diff, but adjustable, and it's a must-have on any road car you plan on upgrading. It allows you to adjust the level of intervention to your preference. The final option is only available on about 20 cars in the game. The Active L.S.D Controller, I believe, is meant to replicate an E-diff, but in the game it feels more like an open diff. I will explain in more detail later. There is also a Torque Vectoring Centre Differential available for most all-wheel drive cars. This simply allows you to tell the car how much power to send to the front or rear wheels, between 50 and 95%. I'll cover this later as well, but for now, I'll cover the fully customizable diff. If you've watched my Taming a Monster series, you may have seen me give a fairly basic explanation of differential tuning before, so here I'll try to give a more detailed explanation. First, we have initial torque. It can also be referred to as breakaway torque or preload. The Google AI definition of initial torque is the amount of torque that locks the differential even when the driven wheels aren't rotating at different speeds. Frankly, that didn't really mean much to me. In Gran Turismo, the higher the value, the faster the differential will respond to accelerator input. What that means to you and me is the higher the value, the more the diff will intervene and clean up the car's behaviour. What it does for the handling is much simpler. Lower values mean the car feels more agile but potentially less stable. For example, the car could become more prone to oversteer when braking. Higher values mean the car feels more predictable and composed but less agile. Higher values will also slightly increase the effectiveness of the next two values. Next is acceleration sensitivity. This effectively determines which wheel the power will be sent to. Lower values mean the diff is more open, sending more power to the wheel with the least grip, which is the inside wheel. Higher values mean the power will go towards the wheel with the most grip, which is the outside wheel. Generally, higher values will make the car lean towards oversteer more than lower values. The trick is finding the balance for your driving style. Last is braking sensitivity. This determines how much the differential will intervene during engine braking. Lower values will make the brakes feel sharper and help with agility and turning at the expense of stability. This is not ideal on rear-heavy cars that are prone to lift-off oversteer. Why does Porsche insist on putting the engine in the wrong bloody place? I thought we grew out of this lunacy when the pyramids were built. Higher values will make the car feel more composed under braking and on corner entry at the expense of agility and sharpness of the brakes. Let's go over some examples. I'll start with the simplest, a front-wheel drive. Because the front wheels have to do everything, these cars can be prone to understeer, so typically we want them to be as agile as we can get them, especially if we're using racing tyres. Low initial torque values and low braking values can help with this. Acceleration makes less of a difference beyond a certain point. If it's set to less than 20, the inside wheel will spin more than the outside wheel, meaning you'll effectively lose power when exiting a corner, and you'll also get more understeer. Increasing acceleration sensitivity helps the car pull itself out of corners, but on higher powered cars it makes less of a difference. There are exceptions though. Some of the faster front-driven cars can be prone to some braking instability on rougher tracks like the Nürburgring, so increasing initial torque and braking sensitivity can help. This also applies to front-wheel drives that aren't using racing tyres. Sports and comfort tyres have lower grip in general, making the car more prone to sliding. So in some cases, increasing the initial torque or braking sensitivity can help tidy up the car's handling. Next up, I will cover a more extreme example of a rear-wheel drive. Muscle cars are typically the hardest to get right, especially on slick tyres. Initial torque comes down to personal preference. Setting it low can help get the car turning, but an 800 horsepower American V8 can be hard to tame, so increasing the initial torque can help calm it down slightly. Acceleration is usually easier to handle if it's set low, between 10 and 20. Too high and the outside wheel will spin too much, making the car feel more prone to oversteer. Too low and the inside wheel will spin too much, making the car feel like shit. Braking sensitivity will also come down to personal preference. When setting up your car, I would recommend starting with a braking value of 5, and if the car is unstable when braking, adjust upwards from there, and I would also do the same with initial torque. For mid or rear engine cars, typically the initial torque will benefit from being set higher than in front engine cars to deliberately make the car feel less agile in order to stabilize it. Acceleration is much the same as other rear-wheel drives. Braking usually has to be set quite high to help with lift-off oversteer, though other things that can help with this are reducing front downforce compared to the rear, or adding ballast weight to the front. Four-wheel drives represent the most convoluted, because we have to adjust for both axles. This is further confused by the Torque Vectoring Centre Differential. I'll start with initial torque using an Impreza as an example thanks to its neutral balanced handling. If we set the initial torque high at the front and rear, the car will be stable but also prone to understeer. Great for cars like the Porsche 959, which can feel like a death trap. If we set it low at the front and rear, the car will be agile, but at the expense of some stability. The car will be faster around a track with lower values, but harder to control thanks to some oversteer under braking. If we set the front low and the rear high, the front end will be agile and the rear will be stable. What that means in practice is the car will be even more prone to oversteer under braking, but when accelerating out of a corner it will be prone to understeer. This is not recommended. If we set the front high and the rear low, we find more of a balance. Increased initial torque at the front will help with braking oversteer, while low initial torque at the rear will make the car less likely to go wide on corner exit. For acceleration sensitivity, I changed to the Peugeot 205 Group B rally car. Its tendency towards oversteer should highlight the changes more, though this means that more neutral cars such as Imprezas and Lancer Evolutions may require some more aggressive settings. Maxing the front and rear will make the car more prone to four-wheel drifts when exiting corners. This can be useful, but harder to control. Setting it to the minimum makes the inside wheels spin, and the car will understeer and generally feel terrible. This is more noticeable if you have more power or less grippy tyres. Maxing the rear and leaving the front at the minimum is something I would only recommend on low-powered cars that are very prone to understeer. On the 205 it makes it feel more like a rear-wheel drive car, but countersteering can result in a violent snap of oversteer, slingshotting you into a hospital. Maxing the front and dropping the rear feels very similar to minimum settings both sides. The car is very prone to spinning the inside rear wheel, which overpowers what the front wheels are doing and leads to understeer. My recommendation would depend on the car. If your car is prone to understeer, maxing the acceleration sensitivity can help the car pull itself out of corners. If your car oversteers when accelerating, I would run between 30 to 60 at the front and between 15 and 35 at the rear. Having it slightly higher at the front will generally help with the car's stability. At the rear, finding the sweet spot between the inside wheel spinning causing understeer and the outside wheel spinning causing oversteer will be the priority. Last, we have braking sensitivity, which as it turns out makes very little difference. Here is a Porsche 959. Anyone who's tuned it will know it's a death trap, because the engine is, to put it scientifically, in the wrong place. To test the effects, I deliberately tried to provoke braking oversteer on the first corner at Suzuka. In the end, I found that braking sensitivity does very little on all-wheel drives. Here is the car with the braking sensitivity set to the minimum, and here it is set to the maximum. I tried the same with the Impreza from earlier too, and got similar results. I also tried this with the initial torque set low, and the initial torque set high to see if it was a case of the differential not intervening enough, but I still found very little difference. What I did find is that having the braking sensitivity set low made the brakes feel slightly sharper, as usual, while setting it high made them feel slightly weaker. I also tried setting the braking high at the front, low at the rear, as well as the other way around, and still found very little difference. It seems that the front initial torque and the ballast weight are the two things that will most affect braking oversteer on all-wheel drive cars. I'll now briefly cover the Torque Distributing Centre Differential. It's fairly simple. You can either send more power to the rear wheels, making your car more like a rear-wheel drive, or you can send up to 50% to the front. Typically, cars with their engines in the middle or the rear, such as the 959 or the newer Lamborghinis, will have power understeer if you send too much power to the front. They'll generally feel more neutral with around 70% of the power sent to the rear, because the rear weight bias means that the rear wheels have more traction. Front-engine cars have less rear traction, so sending more power to the rear will result in power sliding, which can be tough to rescue since the small portion of power going to the front can result in snap oversteer. Sending 40 or 45% of the power to the front wheels will give you that classic four-wheel drive feeling of being glued to the road. And finally, we have the Active L.S.D Controller. It is very rare and only available for a select few cars, and here they are now. AMG Mercedes GTR, Aston Martin DB11, Aston Martin 177, Chevrolet Camaro ZL1, 2013 Dodge Viper, Ferrari F12, 2006 Ford GT, 2017 Ford GT, 2017 Honda NSX, Jaguar F-Type, Lamborghini Aventador, Lamborghini Aventador SV, McLaren F1, McLaren MP4-12C, McLaren 650S, R35 GTR, R35 GTR Nismo, Pagani Huayra. Christ. I might have missed one or two. If I did, please let me know in the comments. Almost all of them are modern supercars, with the exception of the McLaren F1, which is a classic, and the Jaguar F-Type, which is a boat. Initial torque is locked to 50, so we can't adjust it. The adjustment range for acceleration is smaller, locked between 5 and 30, and the braking sensitivity also has a small adjustment range, but much higher, set between 40 and 70. I tested it on the 2006 Ford GT with the settings at 50, 20 and 50. What I found is that the car behaves more like it has an open differential, spinning the inside wheel. While this doesn't feel particularly nice, there's no denying that it's stable. The car also feels quite unwilling to change direction when compared to what I'm used to. Since the fully customisable diff can be set to matching values, I tried it to see if the two diffs are directly comparable on the same settings. Turns out, they're not. On the active controller, the car tended towards understeer, and hard acceleration out of corners would lead to the inside wheel spinning, which was generally more stable. On the customisable L.S.D, the car behaved more as you would expect, kicking the tail out. I also found that adjusting the Active L.S.D made very little difference. Increasing or decreasing acceleration made almost no difference that I could tell, as the inside wheel would still spin on throttle out of corners, whatever it was set to. Braking sensitivity didn't seem to affect much either, so I would almost treat the Active L.S.D controller as a non-adjustable part that completely changes the behaviour of your car. It works fairly well as a one-step solution to the more unstable cars that can have it fitted. If you're having trouble with cars like the Ford GT or McLaren F1, the Active L.S.D controller can make them easier to drive, though it can come at the expense of agility, and the inside wheel spinning can make the car feel subjectively messy compared to the smoother transition to oversteer that you get with a customisable diff. So, that was what turned out to be a much longer video than I expected on differential tuning. Hopefully my advice in this video has helped. That was episode 3 of Tuning for Beginners. Thank you very much for watching, and if this has helped you, I'd be very grateful for your subscription. Take care and ta-ra!